In the opening stages of their invasion, Russian missile systems hit a variety of Ukrainian target types: air bases, ground based air defense installations, training bases, command and control facilities for the military, reserve and concentration bases, the list went on. There were hits on civilian structures, many of them, but generally speaking, targeting of cruise and precision missiles appears to have been slanted towards military targets. But in recent months, Russian efforts have shifted towards the destruction of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, with a particular focus on the power grid. Attacks on substations, power generators, transmission lines have plunged millions of Ukrainians into darkness or left them dealing with rolling blackouts and shortages of fresh flowing water. With winter now here, it seems the Russians have decided that if they can't defeat the Ukrainian military on the battlefield, it may be possible to destroy civilian morale, to deny the civilian population heat and light, and thereby force some sort of concession. In many ways, this is just a modern manifestation of old ideas. Ever since the first German Zeppelin raids on Britain during the First World War, the concept of attacking civilian and productive infrastructure behind the lines using aircraft or missile systems has existed strongly in military theory. The relevant term is strategic bombing, where the focus shifts from the destruction of military and battlefield targets towards the destruction of an enemy's ability or willingness to wage war. During the Second World War, this took the form of the destruction of entire cities and their industrial bases, and now it takes the form of missile attacks on critical infrastructure. But while strategic bombing is certainly an old idea, it's not an uncontroversial one. And in today's video, I want to focus on a very simple question. When it comes to destroying the capability and willingness of a country to fight on, does strategic bombing actually work? To that end, I'm going to give a brief history of strategic bombing, what it is, how it's been conducted in the past, and then I'm going to look very specifically at the Russian campaign in Ukraine as we've seen it so far. I'm going to look at classic problems of strategic bombing, like the adaptation problem, and also ask questions about their historical effectiveness against military production, industrial capabilities, and the morale of civilian populations. I'm going to close out by asking some questions around the sustainability of both the bombing campaign and Ukraine's defense efforts, and ask, ultimately, what might happen next. In trying to predict outcomes, expect this episode to look a lot more at history than some of the other ones I've done, because even though history isn't determinative, there's always a chance that this campaign will be different. Looking at the results of past strategic bombing campaigns might help us make predictions about the future. But before we jump into it, I did want to welcome back returning sponsor, Morning Brew. Morning Brew offers a free daily newsletter that drops every day, Monday to Sunday, and they've got a little bit of a different take on the news than I do. Whereas I will happily spend an hour explaining that cold plus wet is a bad combination for soldiers, Morning Brew offers short, sharp 5-minute summaries of the day's events covering everything from international events to business and technology. In the space of just a couple of paragraphs and dot points, you can get a quick view of just how crazy 2022 continues to be. In recent weeks, for example, you could have followed the ongoing collapse of multiple cryptocurrency exchanges, or you could have followed international events. As you can see from the note there on the screen about both Germany and Peru, for example, if I had $1 for every terribly planned coup attempt in the last week, I'd have $2, which, as the saying goes, isn't much, but it is strange that it happened twice. So if you're interested in getting a 5-minute news summary every morning, signing up is completely free, quick and simple. I think it took me about a minute when I originally registered. If you are interested, there's a QR code on the screen, a link in the description, and that link is morningbrewdaily.com/Perun. Now, given the nature of the topic, I thought it might be worth putting in a brief word about sourcing and references. There's been a lot of study of strategic bombing throughout history, and as always, a number of the links to primary and secondary sources will be in the description, but I want to call out a few sets of sources I rely on pretty heavily now. When talking about the effectiveness of World War II strategic bombing, I'm relying very heavily on the United States strategic bombing surveys, which were very complex assessments carried out to evaluate the effectiveness of the bombing campaigns very close to the end of the war, in 1945 for Germany, 1946 for Japan. Regarding the Russian campaign, I'm relying very heavily on the Royal United Service Institute's publications about the early stage of the war. They published a fantastic study of the war up to June recently, which I will link in the description. And then finally, I wanted to extend my thanks to the many people in Ukraine who I'm in touch with who have provided first-hand accounts of the impacts, adaptation efforts, and essentially put a face on the survey results that we'll be using later on in this piece. Anecdotes are ultimately limited as an evidence source, but they do put a little bit of colour on what can otherwise be quite sterile survey data. Okay, so before we talk about whether strategic bombing works, it's probably worthwhile to know what on earth it is. While it's been framed in different ways by many different theoreticians, the basic idea of strategic bombing is that you can destroy the will or capability of a country to resist, not by targeting military forces at the front or military bases, but instead factories, infrastructure, and indeed even civilian populations themselves behind the lines. To help draw the lines for those who may not be super familiar with military terminology, if a unit is under attack on the battlefield and they call for support, aircraft show up, they see some tanks attacking those troops and they blow up those tanks, that's close air support. If aircraft launch a pre planned mission to go and destroy the base of an armoured division, destroy the tanks there, that's a ground attack mission. If the aircraft go and destroy the factory building the tanks, that's strategic bombing. There would be some experimentation with strategic bombing, albeit on what we would now consider to be a pretty small scale during World War I. The Germans would win the dubious honour of being the first to bomb cities from the air during the war when their airships attacked Belgian cities in 1914, while the British Royal Naval Air Service would launch attacks on Zeppelin production yards and sheltering sheds. Later German bombing raids on London would whip up a considerable amount of hysteria, but in terms of overall damage done, it was relatively minor. Strategic bombing during the Second World War, however, would be a very different beast. Technology and industrial capacity had evolved. Bombing raids were not going to be a matter of a couple of balloons dropping artillery shells over the sides or some rickety biplane bombers operating in small numbers. Now it was going to be modern aircraft dropping thousands of pounds of bombs each in formations that, by the end of the war, would reach more than 1,000 aircraft on a single raid. Both Germany and Japan would attack cities from the earliest days of the war, but later on it became clear that with their superior industrial capacity, it would be the Allies that would take strategic bombing to scale. Over Germany, the Allies would drop 2.7 million tons of bombs with 1.44 million bomber sorties. It would destroy 3.6 million dwelling units or homes, 300,000 Germans would be killed, and 780,000 wounded. 7.5 million would be made homeless by the time the war ended. The effectiveness of these raids would vary greatly over the course of the war, but by war's end, they had had a shattering effect on key elements of the German war economy. Ultimately, however, they would not induce Germany to surrender. That would not happen until Soviet troops rose their flag over the Reichstag and Germany fell into occupation. One challenge faced by advocates of strategic bombing during the Second World War was that accuracy was frankly terrible. For British aircraft bombing at night, hitting within a couple of miles of the thing you were aiming at was considered a pretty good achievement. And for the Americans, on multiple occasions, American bombers missed the country that they were aiming at, accidentally bombing Switzerland when they were going for Germany. By Korea and later Vietnam, technology had of course improved, but physics still has a problem with the idea of trying to hit a particular object using a dumb bomb dropped from high altitude. By the end of the Korean War, for example, many North Korean cities had essentially been flattened by carpet bombing. Of course, even that wasn't enough to force the North Koreans to surrender, and the war would end with a ceasefire along a military demarcation line not that far removed from the lines between the two sides when it all started. As the decades went on, though, strategic bombing changed. It had to. Surface-to-air missiles and fighters made it simply too dangerous to fly mass formations of bombers over targets and carpet bomb them with dumb bombs. At the same time, precision and standoff munitions were being invented, which meant it was possible to much more accurately hit strategic targets without a massive formation of bombers flying over the target. Bomber forces around the world began to shrink their fleets and deploy more cruise missiles, converting the old Cold War warhorses that had been designed to drop tons and tons and tons of dumb bombs into essentially cruise missile carriers. And that is essentially the role that the modern Russia bomber force fills, as a vehicle or a delivery system for standoff munitions. Russia's bomber fleet is essentially a legacy holdover of the Soviet era, but it is one of the very few strategic bombing forces left in the world. Many countries that used to operate heavy strategic bombers, like Britain, have completely divested them. The most capable bomber in the Russian inventory is probably the Tupolev 160, the blackjack in NATO parlance, but there's only about 16 of these aircraft in service. There are 60 Tupolev 95s, the famous Bear, which is a turbopropped powered bomber, and about 61 Tupolev 22s. None of these aircraft are optimized for aerial carpet gravity bombing. The crews aren't trained for it, the aircraft aren't configured for it. Instead, they form part of Russia's nuclear deterrent fleet and a delivery system for cruise missiles. And it's in that latter role that they've seen extensive service in the war in Ukraine. So with that said, let's look at the Russian campaign so far and the way it's evolved. In the opening stages of the war, the Russians absolutely let rip with a number of their missile and rocket systems. For the Ukrainian defenders, the first few days were particularly challenging. Air defences were busy dispersing from their pre war positions to make sure they weren't hit by the missile attacks, and Russian jamming was at some of its most effective. They were, of course, also jamming their own forces in many cases, but they were impacting the Ukrainian defenders. Usage rates were generally high. Over the 67 days between the invasion opening and the 1st of May, RUSI assesses the Russians fired something like 180 air-launched cruise missiles and a remarkable 200 SS-26s. These are the Iskander TBMs. Now, this is an incredibly dangerous system. As a short-range ballistic missile, it's a lot harder to shoot down than a cruise missile coming in on a somewhat flat trajectory. And as we discovered during the opening stage of the war, it seems like a lot of Iskanders actually have penetration aids, little decoys they will release during their descent into a target to make it harder for them to be intercepted. They're accurate, they have a heavy warhead, and they're very hard to shoot down. And in the opening stage of the war, Russia fired more than 200 of them against a variety of target types, which is particularly notable when you realise that that is essentially nearly 3 years' worth of production fired off in 67 days. At this point, where Russian intelligence was good, the missile systems tended to perform pretty well. They'd make course corrections on their way to the target, and the intercept rate by Ukrainian air defences was absolutely horrible, something like 12 to 18%, because they were disrupted both by the suppression by the missile attacks and by jamming and by the need to disperse themselves to avoid those missile attacks. It also couldn't really be called a strategic bombing campaign because most of the targets were military in nature. Ground-based air defense locations, command and control facilities, ammunition dumps, storages for vehicles, training bases, concentrations of Ukrainian troops, some industrial targets, and yes, some civilian targets too, but not a consolidated strategic bombing campaign in any case. With the usage rates for things like the Caliber and the Iskander being dangerously high, the Russians appear to have begun to introduce new systems in order to make up strike numbers. Systems like the Bastion firing Onyx missiles, meant to be a coastal defense system, increasingly fired against ground targets. If you want more information on Russian systems and targeting during this period, check out the video I did on cruise missiles in Ukraine some months ago now. One thing I'll note on reflection is it's interesting to think how the Russian missile campaign now might have been changed if they hadn't fired so many of their SS-26 Iskander missiles during the opening stages of the war. As the war dragged on, the Russian usage of certain missile systems began to fall off. They were no longer firing Iskander or Caliber at the same rate as before. But beginning in October, attacks ramped up again with an entirely new targeting set. Following the dramatic Ukrainian victory during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, the Russians would instead adopt a new strategy of launching large missile attacks every 1 to 2 weeks on critical Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly the energy grid. During a wave of attacks from the 10th to the 12th of October, the Russians would hit about 30% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. This was not the first time Russia had hit civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. It had done so almost since the beginning of the war. But this was the first time there was a concerted, large-scale attack clearly aimed at unpicking the weaknesses of one aspect of Ukraine's infrastructure. And what was the response of Russian military bloggers and state media? Well, after the criticism and embarrassment of the so-called Kharkiv repositioning, the response to Ukrainian cities falling into darkness was one of elation and triumphalism. Now, for those of you familiar with history, the idea of switching from military to civilian targets with your bombing effort in order to bolster civilian morale at home, that's not entirely a new idea, but the question should still be asked, why would Russia have made this switch in targeting priorities? And on this point, I'll concede it's very, very difficult to be certain. None of us are privy, I would hope, to the internal discussions of the Russian government. But a variety of theories have been put forward. The first was this was about domestic politics, that Russia was suffering military embarrassment after the Kharkiv offensive, that people were turning on the government, criticizing the MOD, and that bombing a bunch of Ukrainian infrastructure and very visibly causing suffering to the Ukrainian people would convince people that Russia was still strong, Russia was still capable, in control, that it could punish those who had the temerity to, throw Russian troops out of part of the country they had invaded. The second theory was more military in nature. The idea is that Ukraine might now be able to redeploy troops from Kharkiv to Kherson. Most of the Ukrainian railway is electrically powered, so depowering some of the power grid might inhibit that movement. The third theory was this was just classic strategic bombing targeting the will to resist, both of the Ukrainians and Western governments, that by inflicting suffering, it was more likely that they would come to the peace table. And the final theory was this was an attempt to divert Ukrainian air defense assets from the front, push them to the rear areas they had to defend power stations and transformers, rather than shooting down Russian aircraft on the front line. It's entirely possible that multiple objectives came together to encourage the Russians to make the switch. I find some of these ideas more convincing than others. The immediate response of state media and its support suggests that domestic politics probably played a significant role here. And on the idea of the destruction of Ukrainian air defences, well, if the goal was to destroy or degrade Ukrainian air defences, taking air defences off the target list for missile attack in a big way seems a little counterintuitive, as does targeting facilities well behind the lines. If you're targeting things near the front line and forcing Ukrainian air defences to light their radar and make themselves vulnerable to anti radiation missiles and things like that, you might be able to steadily break down the strength of Ukrainian air defences. At the front, Ukrainian air defences are vulnerable to things like the Lancet loitering munition. But if you get them to move their air defense systems to Kyiv and cities hundreds of kilometers behind the lines, well, then you're not going to be able to destroy them anywhere near as effectively. So I'd suggest that while all of these reasons may have played a role, as may have some that aren't listed here, politics and morale seem to have been front of mind. The second part of this question is, having chosen to attack critical civilian infrastructure, why choose energy specifically? And unfortunately, there's a lot of reasons that this sort of targeting makes sense once you've made the decision to try and knock out the civilian economy. For one thing, power is basically a critical input into almost anything a society does. You don't have to knock out each individual factory for ammunition or tanks or components if you can just knock out the power grid that allows those factories to operate. If your goal is just to make the lives of civilians as miserable as possible, removing power is one way to do it. It's critical to heating, to refrigeration, to communications, to lighting, to transport, to so many critical elements of quality of life. And unfortunately, despite energy being critical, it's relatively soft infrastructure. If you think about something like a tank factory, it's likely to have brick walls, heavy mechanical equipment inside involved in the production that requires a significant warhead and a direct hit to comprehensively demolish. Power substations and transmission lines are out in the open. They're relatively delicate and easy to damage. Even something like a Shahed 136 with a 50-kilogram warhead is going to be able to do significant damage to exposed energy infrastructure. Energy infrastructure is also very widely dispersed. Transmission lines run all the way across the country. There are substations everywhere, so that it's difficult to spread enough ground-based air defense around a country enough to cover all of that infrastructure, which means there's always likely to be at least a couple of critical points that can be singled out for attack. And finally, it can be quite slow to repair energy infrastructure, if only because a lot of the components involved aren't standardized, have long order lead times. It's a difficult thing to do to bring a grid that is being picked apart back online quickly. And picking apart the grid is exactly what Russia is trying to do. You can't destroy all of Ukraine's ability to generate power. Half of its energy generation pre-war came from nuclear energy generation, and Russia is not at the point where it's happy to openly sling cruise missiles into nuclear power plants, and nuclear power plants themselves tend to be very, very hardened against strikes and attacks. What you can do, and you also can't destroy European generation, and there's some infrastructure to allow power imports into Ukraine from Europe, and you can have localized generators and backups, etc. So you can't destroy all of the generation capacity. What you can do is destroy some of the generation capacity and then pick apart the connections in the grid that enables power to be shared and load to be balanced across the grid to force either total blackouts or rolling blackouts in different parts of the grid in order to keep things stabilized. And the issue there is it doesn't take many weapon systems to get through in order to cause those sorts of disruptions. Even if you get a ground-based air defense interception rate of like 80 or 90% on an ongoing basis, one bad day, a couple of missiles, a couple of drones in the right spot getting lucky is enough to cause a significant disruption which might affect potentially millions of people. It's unlikely to have much impact on the Ukrainian military, which is going to have its own generators, its own communications, its own backups, get priority over rail transit and diesel locomotives, etc. But that can have a very significant impact on the civilian population. And so, Russia has chosen this as its target set. In any case, Russian media seemed to think that the MOD was onto a winner, and the strikes kept coming. Between the 10th and the 12th of October, a strike of 80-plus missiles and drones caused significant outages across Ukraine. Ukraine claimed, and I stress claimed, 43 missiles shot down. In late October, a smaller follow-up strike also had a Ukrainian interception rate of around 50% claimed and caused more than 1 million people to temporarily lose power. The strikes in November were perhaps the most intense, with 2 large strikes, one in early November and one on 23 November. Ukrainian claims around interception rates began to climb, But the sheer scale of the attacks, plus the fact the infrastructure was already damaged from previous strikes, meant the effect on the Ukrainian grid was severe. In the image on the right there, you can see the impact of some of the worst November blackouts, where Ukraine essentially became a black hole on the map when compared to the bright ball around cities like Moscow. The most recent December attacks were sort of a mixed bag for Ukraine. On one hand, their interception rate increased with the arrival of new Western systems, claiming about 60 out of 70 missiles shot down, and also the overall size of the Russian salvo decreased compared to the largest attacks we've seen so far. But at the same time, it's unambiguously clear that some of the missiles did get through, causing further damage to the already suffering grid and causing outages in locations like Odessa. In Ukraine, planned blackouts day by day are essentially the new normal, while some areas have to endure after each attack significant periods without running water or consistent power. Now, I don't feel I'm the right person to give an evaluation on whether a given action breaches international law or not. But I did want to look at how Russia has claimed to justify these attacks and how consistent their messaging is. There are a number of claims Russia has used to justify their attacks on energy infrastructure, the most recent of which was made by Putin on TV quite recently. Now, some of these justifications I find self-defeating on their face. For example, the Russians justify the bombing of Ukrainian energy infrastructure by saying NATO bombed Serbian energy infrastructure in the 1990s, which is entirely true. The problem to me is Russia contends that that bombing was bad, evil, illegal, should never have happened, wasn't allowed, etc. And Ukraine wasn't involved in those bombings. It was NATO doing it, which basically makes this as morally and ideologically consistent as witnessing someone rob a store, calling the police and demanding the perpetrator go into prison, but also feeling justified in now robbing a store yourself and arguing there should be no consequences. In terms of other arguments, like the fact that Ukraine attacked the Crimean bridge, therefore Russia should feel comfortable attacking civilian infrastructure, well, that fails just because of the linear passage of time. The first Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure far predated the attack on the Crimean bridge, so that doesn't really fly. But instead of arguing back and forth around the edges, I want to try and get to the core of what the Russian way of thinking here is. What, according to Russia, constitutes terrorism as opposed to an attack on a legitimate military target? Because if the Kremlin doesn't want to be judged by Western or international standards, let's try and judge it by its own. After the attack on the Crimean bridge in October, Dmitry Medvedev came out and made some pretty clear statements. Now let's remember, this is allegedly a Ukrainian attack on a piece of civilian infrastructure. The bridge is a piece of civilian infrastructure that was being used to support the logistic and mobility requirements of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Supplies were continuously coming across that bridge to support Russian armed forces units in Crimea and in Kherson. Those armed forces were directly engaged in combat with the Ukrainians during a time of war. But Dmitry Medvedev was very clear. This was a bit of civilian infrastructure, and attacking it was an act of terrorism. And the only reasonable response, according to Dmitry Medvedev, was to kill the, quote, terrorists responsible. Also in October, there were an attack on Russian military ships in Sevastopol using unmanned sea vehicles, little drones that basically crashed into the ships and exploded. So this is an attack on military ships in what the vast majority of the world considers Ukrainian territory, because the vast majority of nations, including Russia's ostensible allies, recognize Crimea as Ukrainian territory, while the ships that were harbored there had either recently launched missiles against Ukraine or participated in military operations against Ukraine, or would foreseeably shortly in the future participate in actions against Ukraine. And in fact, many of those ships did subsequently participate in actions against Ukraine. But when these ships were attacked, the Russians described it as a terrorist action. Apparently, attacking military ships in a military harbor during a war is terrorism. And of course, recently there was the alleged drone attack on Russian strategic air bases, targeting the bombers that were launching these cruise missile attacks on Ukraine. So military airbase, a solely military airbase housing military aircraft in time of war, when those aircraft have been used and continue to be used to launch cruise missile attacks on a belligerent during that war. And you guessed it, this was terrorism. Quote, the Kiev regime, in order to disable Russian long-range aircraft, made attempts to strike with Soviet-made unmanned jet aerial vehicles at the military airfields at blah, 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 blah. And they called this a terrorist act, a terrorist action designed to disable our bombers. So according to the Russian standards, I have to conclude that an attack on military aircraft on a military airbase during a war is illegal. So I would love to know how they justify attacking civilian infrastructure during a special military operation. Now, obviously, moral coherency is not a necessary prerequisite to a successful military operation, but I feel I would have done the whole situation a bit of a disservice if I didn't at least call this out. Regardless of the morality or the legality involved, in terms of the way forward, it seems likely that there will be more strikes. There's already been significant damage to Ukrainian infrastructure. It's likely the Russians will launch repeat attacks. There will be a race between the ability of the Russians to inflict damage, that is, to sustain their supplies of missiles, aircraft, launchers, and targeting information, and the ability of Ukrainians to defend, that both by repairing their infrastructure and receiving new ground based or air based air defences from the West. And since it looks like this campaign will now drag on and continue, the question then becomes, based on the history of strategic bombing, will it work? And to figure that out, I want to look at the historical performance of strategic bombing in three key areas: disrupting industrial production, doing damage to the military potential of a state, and breaking civilian morale. Historically, disrupting economic activity is probably what strategic bombing has been best at. It's also probably the least relevant task in Ukraine. One day I hope to do a video on war economies and why they don't collapse anywhere near as fast as people seem to expect them to, and thus why wars tend to go much longer than people expect them to. But for now, let's stick to the basics. If you're looking for a straight answer to whether or not strategic bombing can destroy productive capacity in an economy, the short answer is it depends on a whole range of factors, and the long answer is yes, but it's difficult and requires substantial effort depending on the target type. There are a whole range of factors ranging from how widely dispersed sites are, how much slack production capacity there is, the dependencies of that production site, and also just the hardness of the production materials. It turns out, for example, that the lift you might use to carry a tank on a production line is usually a pretty heavy bit of machinery. So if you set off a bomb nearby, that bit of machinery is usually going to be fine, certainly more fine than any squishy employees who happen to be nearby. But if you drop a bomb within the same postcode as a semiconductor factory, I'm pretty sure you can write a lot of it off. As a result of all these factors, historically speaking, most strategic bombing during World War II didn't do that much damage to the opposing war economy. For example, the survey found that the city attacks of the RAF prior to autumn 1944 did not substantially affect the course of German war production. Also, the Allies during World War II bombed a number of specific targets within the German industrial system. The attacks on the ball bearing industry, which was sometimes very expensive, achieved basically nothing in terms of impacting German war production. A more interesting story is looking at German oil production, because it illustrates where and when strategic bombing can work quite well. Germany during the Second World War was incredibly dependent on synthetic oil production, where you produce your oil products through chemical processes rather than just pumping it up from the ground and then refining it. Now, given that just about everything runs on oil or oil derivatives, whether it be planes or tanks or the economy in general, it didn't take a genius to figure out that maybe the Allies should bomb Germany's oil industry, which is something they really started to do in 1944. By July 1944, every synthetic oil plant in Germany had been hit at least once. Production had fallen from 316,000 tonnes a month at the start of the year to 107,000 tonnes in June, and this absolutely scared German leaders who kind of needed the petroleum and other fuel products. But those headline figures don't capture just how many attacks were necessary or how quickly Germany was able to put destroyed facilities back into production. During peacetime, we often associate the Germans with bureaucracy, slow and considered action, but history, both then and now, seems to suggest that when the Germans are willing to throw the rulebook out the window and improvise, they can work incredibly quickly, whether it's building LNG infrastructure in 2022 or getting synthetic oil plants running again in 1944. And if your opponent is able to quickly repair infrastructure and bring it back online, then strategic bombing is as much about persistence as everything else. And to illustrate that point, I want to quickly tell you a story. It's time to hear the tale of the Linebacker. The Leuna Works were a truly gargantuan synthetic oil facility. The combined defenders, repair crew, and staff numbered in the tens of thousands, and it was a critical linchpin in German synthetic oil production. So, of course, the Allies wanted to get rid of it. On May the 12th, 1944, it was thoroughly bombed and put out of action. The Germans had partially resumed production by May 22nd. So on May 28th, it was hit and disabled again and was operational again on June the 3rd. By July, early July, it was up to 75% productive capacity again. By July 7th, it was attacked and shut down. On July 9th, it was operational. By 19th July, it was back up to 53% capacity. So the Allies bombed it on the 20th of July and it shut down for 3 days before by July 27, it was operating again at 35% capacity. It was attacked on the 28th of July, the 29th of July, the 24th of August, the 11th of September, the 13th of September, the 28th of September. The list truly does go on. Over the course of the war, the Linebacker would be hit by 6,552 bomber sorties, dropping 18.3 thousand tons of bombs. Despite that, it would still average 10% productivity because the Germans kept fixing the damn thing. Heavy industrial machinery is hard to destroy, expedient repairs are possible, and defenders are able to adapt to damage and hardened structures. They got better at repairing the works as the war went on, not worse. The key then with strategic bombing against industrial targets is not just to bomb industrial sites and take them offline once, it's about persistence and precision. Destroying a site once is not enough unless you thoroughly demolish it. If you just put it out of action, you need to be able to keep up the pressure. And that holds whether the target is a factory or energy infrastructure or any other industrial target that you might want to hit. Unless you're nuking it, someone is going to find a way to fix it, even if it's only held together with duct tape and baling wire. Which leaves Russia with two problems in this area in Ukraine. The first is it just doesn't have the weapon systems necessary to repeat attacks against targets time and time again. And the second problem, perhaps the greater problem, is just like in the Korean War or the Vietnam War, the war industry supporting the power that you're trying to knock out isn't actually located in the target country. Attacks on Ukrainian industry make life inconvenient for the Ukrainians by slowing domestic production, but ultimately speaking, if the Russians wanted to disable the war economy supporting Ukraine, they'd need to be hitting targets in the United States and Europe in order to shut down supply entirely. I think we can safely put that one in the extraordinarily unlikely column, although knowing fighter pilots, I can imagine there are a couple in NATO that wish the Russians would try. The next question is whether or not historically strategic bombing directly inhibits the operation of military forces. And in this respect, I want to talk about two items: mobility and communications on one hand, and the cost of defending against air attack on the other. A good example of that first category might be when strategic bombers or missile systems are used to target things like rail centers. If you destroy the rail network, it's harder for the military to move units around. So even if you're not destroying the military units, and even if they've still got their equipment coming in from the factory, they might not be able to get to where they're needed. And in Ukraine, we have seen some attacks on rail infrastructure by Russian missile attacks. So the question is, how likely are these attacks likely to be? And historically speaking, the lessons from the attack on the German transportation system have a lot in common with the lessons of the attack on oil. It has to be done at scale, it has to be repeated, and there's a lot of repair work that can be done. Generally speaking, the survey concluded that the railway system in Germany was pretty adequate until spring 1944. There had been attacks before then, sure, but they weren't happening on the scale to actually cause problems. Towards the end, when the attacks ramped up to a truly apocalyptic scale, there was a decline. 900,000 cars being loaded and transported a week in the week ending August 19, 555,000 in the week ending December 23. But December 23, 1944 is pretty bloody late in the war, which means you're not having that much impact through the vast majority of the fighting. In Vietnam and Korea, similarly, attacks happened on a lavish scale, but they weren't able to prevent supplies arriving from foreign countries like the Soviet Union and China in order to sustain them in the fight. The problems here really are myriad. In Vietnam and Korea, it was the ability of the country involved to adapt, to transport things by alternative means, to move stuff at night, to make use of things as low-tech as bicycles or porters, as well as trains in order to move equipment. And in Germany, the problem is it's relatively easy to repair a destroyed bit of rail. Locomotives are harder to replace, but basic rail infrastructure, unless it's completely pulverized, is a relatively quick repair job. So in some ways, just as with industrial targets, paralyzing a target might be possible. Keeping it offline, that's more difficult. The problem Russia faces in Ukraine, essentially, is there's a lot of rail infrastructure in Ukraine and relatively few Russian missiles to allocate to those targets. And if you're aware the Ukrainians are going to be able to repair any potential damage relatively quickly, if you're going to use a multi-million-dollar missile to strike a target, you better have a plan to exploit the temporary breakdown in transportation. Perhaps more significant in Ukraine's case is the cost of defending against air attack. Throughout history, defending against air attack can be a very expensive proposition. It's true in World War II, in Korea, or in Vietnam. I really don't want to get lost on a tangent, but during World War II, a very significant amount of German war production, of fighters, of artillery, of ammunition, was diverted to the task of air defense. The Leuna we talked about before had a flak division responsible for protecting it, an entire division. There were hundreds of flak guns and thousands of firefighters and repair crew involved. In Vietnam, on average, entire salvos of surface-to-air missiles would need to be fired for each B-52 or American aircraft shot down. And whether it be Germany in 1944 or Ukraine in 2022, air defences and resources that are spent defending targets behind the lines aren't present on the front, making a difference there. And if you're a Ukrainian unit that regularly has to deal with Russian helicopter or fixed-wing aircraft attack, you probably wish that an extra Buk or NASAM system was with you rather than the rear having to defend a power plant. Overall, the impact to Ukraine in this sense from the Russian missile and strategic bombing attacks is difficult to assess. We know, for example, that Ukraine is highly dependent on electric railway locomotives, and that some railway transport lines have been de-energized at times. But we also know that rail traffic between key centres continues. We know that the Ukrainians are adapting in certain ways, bringing out diesel locomotives, for example. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So assessing the scale at which this is actually a serious problem is difficult. As for the diversion of air defense systems in order to protect rear area infrastructure instead of troops at the front, that's obviously a feature. We know that because we know air defense installations are protecting critical infrastructure and seen shooting down incoming missiles. But at the same time, we know that the Russian Air Force still isn't flying raids past the front line. They're still being very, very cautious, and there are some recent visually confirmed aircraft losses. So while we can't be sure exactly how many systems have been diverted to protect, for example, say, the power grid, we can conclude that what remains at the front so far is enough to maintain contested airspace and force the Russians to stay on their side of the line, at least mostly. But beyond questions of industrial production or military utility, there's the question of civilian morale, and in some ways this seems to be the most important. After all, industrial production can be made up for by bringing in more equipment from the West. Military equipment likewise can be replaced. But if the will of the people fails and the people of a country demand surrender, well, that's it. War over. And people throughout history have latched onto this idea that bombing civilians is a great way to convince them to give up. This is, on the screen, this gentleman here, this is Giulio. Giulio is an Italian theoretician, one of the early theoreticians of strategic bombing. And for him, there are a number of targets for strategic air power: industry, infrastructure, communications, government, and perhaps most importantly, the will of the people. He didn't want you to bomb battlefield targets. He wanted to destroy the willingness of a civilian population to resist, so they would rise up against their government and stop the war. Now, Douhet's ideas were quite influential, but he was also terrible at math, which is kind of a problem when you're dealing with military science. The problem with Douhet's thinking, one of the many problems with Douhet's thinking, and that of many interwar theoreticians, was a massive overestimation of the damage that would be caused by bombing. He'd do things like assume that dropping 20 tons of bombs would destroy and kill everything in a 500-meter diameter circle, and that because bombers can, of course, perfectly space their bombs out, you just have to figure out how many 500-meter diameter circles cover a city to destroy the whole thing. You scale that sort of logic to its maximal conclusion, and you end up projecting nuclear war casualties using 1920s aircraft. In the face of those sort of casualties, the conclusion was the surrender of the civilian population was really the only option. And yet the Allies would drop millions of tons of bombs on the Axis powers, and generally speaking, morale would hold. The USSBS after the war made the following findings. As a result of the bombings in Germany, it found morale and confidence did decline, often in a sense that the local population were less confident in the idea of final victory, but, quote, they continued to work efficiently as long as the physical means of production remained. That is, German workers became more and more convinced the propaganda was wrong and Germany was fighting a nearly impossible struggle, but the response was to go back to work anyway. In Japan, the situation was arguably even more marked. Overall, Japan would suffer about 330,000 dead out of 806,000 estimated casualties from strategic bombing, according to the USSBS. But they made the following findings on Japanese morale. In June 1944, 46% of Japanese civilians felt that victory was no longer possible. By this point, Japan doesn't have a fleet. Japan has been on the defensive for years. Japan is completely and utterly outmatched. Japan is being bombed daily, and a narrow majority of people still think they can win this thing. After Japan is nuked twice, and the Soviets invade Manchuria, the amount of Japanese people who think that they're going to lose increases to 68%. But that doesn't mean that they push the government to surrender. Based on interviews, reviews of Japanese documents, the survey found that until the end, the emperor still largely escaped criticism, and the Japanese people, even after they no longer thought they could win, probably would have just continued to resist if the emperor had ordered them to do so. Even after 2 nuclear strikes, it was the will of the government that broke before the will of the people did. Now, maybe you think this is just a coincidence. Maybe you think that the British and the Germans and the Japanese and every other body of people that was significantly bombed during the Second World War were just a particularly fanatical lot determined to resist to the very end, and that generally speaking, this sort of tactic could work. All right, let's talk about Korea and Vietnam. The air war in Korea began with many restrictions around potential collateral damage, but by the end of it, as one veteran remarked, basically the USAF was dropping bombs on any structure that consisted of more than 2 bricks stacked on top of each other. 600,000 plus tons of bombs were dropped, and the target list over many cities was completely exhausted. North Korea probably came closer to any other country in history to being completely flattened by strategic bombing. And yet, civilian morale held, and North Korea would survive the Korean War. The story of the bombing of Vietnam is more complex from a targeting and a political perspective, but the full might of United States air power was unleashed on Vietnam. The tonnage of bombs dropped during that conflict was greater than the European theatre of World War II. Casualties were tremendous, but civilian morale didn't break. The North Vietnamese held on. They would sign a peace deal for American withdrawal, and then shortly after American withdrawal, they would ultimately win the war by overrunning South Vietnam. By the end of these wars, the living standards for civilians, particularly in the Korean case, were abysmal, and yet they held on to win. The historical record seems to suggest that people are not fans of having bombs dropped on them from the sky, but they don't tend to respond to that frustration by seeking to surrender. For the most part, they might complain, they might grumble, but then they get angry and get on with the job. Morale, I would argue historically, is a lot harder to destroy than industrial equipment. It's harder to knock out than factories and rail lines. Humans are incredibly stubborn, and they will endure an awful lot before they give up to coercion. And so far, at least, the numbers seem to bear out the historical precedent in Ukraine as well. According to the best polling data we have, which is midway through the missile campaign, there are still strong majorities of Ukrainians in favor of fighting on until victory. And most Ukrainians still define victory as taking back all of Russia's occupied territory, including Crimea. The willingness to go on varies by age and geography. That's to be expected. The support for continuing the fight is lower in the east and the south, the places closer to the front line, than it is in the west, which is comparatively further away from the battlefield. But all those regions still show majorities in favor of fighting on. And when you look at those who favor peace talks of some sort, they may favor peace talks, but they don't favor giving any significant concessions to the Russians in order to secure peace. They just seem to want peace talks that give them what they want on their terms. There is some nuance that I can read into these statistics based on the findings of the survey and past conflicts. And the biggest one is this. The biggest morale impact of strategic bombing historically that's been observed is on confidence, the belief in the ability of the country to win. And the dividing line between people who respond to bombing with melancholy and depression versus those who respond by intensifying their efforts with sort of patriotic resentment. The situations like we sometimes saw in Germany during the Second World War of bombing a facility actually leading to increased production as people got pissed. The difference often is whether or not those people think they can win. Most Ukrainians are confident they can win. That's what the statistics we have available to us and what the anecdotal evidence I've seen suggests to us. The Ukrainians believe that they can win this war, and as long as they believe that they can ultimately win, bombing is unlikely, based on the historical precedent, to achieve much of anything at all rather than increasing human suffering and further mobilizing the Ukrainian population. Ukrainians have watched their military reclaim vast tracts of territory. They've seen the Kharkiv offensive. They've seen the success and the liberation of Kherson. And in that context, it's difficult for the Russians to convince the Ukrainians that they will not ultimately win, just because of some strikes on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Enough to cause misery, sure, but to convince Ukrainians that they're not going to win, that's something entirely different. Nor is it likely that these attacks are going to achieve much of anything, industrially, militarily, or in terms of impacting morale, if they cannot be appropriately sustained. Similarly, Ukraine is in a much worse position if its defensive efforts can't be sustained. So let's turn our eyes now to the question of how long the respective sides can potentially keep this up. And we'll start with the Russians, for whom sustainability is basically synonymous with whether or not they're going to run out of the weapons they use to launch these attacks. And I'm not blind to the fact that every time Russia launches another salvo of long range cruise and ballistic missiles at Ukrainian targets, there will always be commenters that come out and say, hey, I thought the West said that the Russians were running out of missiles back in June or July. And to be fair, a number of sources were pointing the finger at potential weapons depletion for the Russians from the relatively early days of the war. The answer, of course, is that there is a very big difference between running out and run out. When people say, for example, the United States is running out of 155mm shells to give Ukraine, they don't actually mean the US is running out of 155. The US still has an awful lot of 155. What they mean is that the stockpile of 155mm rounds in the United States has been decreased to the point where the US is starting to get concerned about whether they have enough to fight all of the potential contingencies they're worried about at the same time. In other words, they're running out of their spare stuff and they have to start thinking about whether or not they impact readiness. Russia similarly needs to keep or wants to keep a percentage of its high precision munitions in reserve for potential other contingencies. But as the war has gone on, as a number of observers have noticed, the Russians are likely decreasing the percentage of weapons they feel that they need to keep in reserve. They've been willing to risk and deplete more units, more forces, and more of these specialized weapons in order to try and change the situation in Ukraine. The second factor is just because of the sanctions, it doesn't mean Russia stops producing these weapons. It becomes more difficult, it becomes more expensive, it becomes difficult to expand production dramatically. But even the Ukrainians will estimate the Russians are still producing Caliber. They're still producing Iskander, albeit not at fantastic rates. So even if hypothetically the Russians spent 100% of their rockets, it would still be possible for them to launch another attack like this one a couple of months later as new ones arrived from the factories. And then finally, there's the point around imports. When they bring drones or other strike weapons in from Iran or other countries, obviously that increases the number of weapons they have available to make these strikes. No Western intelligence agency is suggesting that Russia has run out of these weapons. What they predict is the percentage depletion of these various systems, and they make assumptions about changing Russian behavior based on what they think the comfort level of the Russians might be in terms of running those systems down. And there's evidence to support that argument. If you look at just one weapon system, Iskander, SS-26, very formidable, difficult for Ukrainian air defenses to intercept. You have to think that any critical infrastructure target within range of this system would be vulnerable now if the Russians still had a bunch of them. But we're not seeing massed Iskander strikes. We're not seeing a month of 100 or a 60-day period of 200 strikes the way we did early in the war. We're not seeing as much of SS-26, even though it's probably the best weapon for the job. And that probably has something to do with the estimates that Russia has used more than 80% of these things that they had on stock at the beginning of the war, and the production rate is something like 6 per month. My point is that Russian behavior is entirely consistent with the idea that they are running down their stocks of missiles, and that they don't produce enough to keep up this rate of attacks. The fact they're mixing in dummy and decoy missiles, converted target drones, and all of that in order to try and make up the numbers is significant. Even if Russia depleted 100% of their reserves, though, that wouldn't necessarily be the end of the attacks. If you take the pre-war estimates around the production of cruise and ballistic missiles like Iskander, then Russia would be able to sustain this sort of attack, but instead of being a once per 1 to 2 week event, it would be a once per 3 to 4 month event, while leaving basically nothing for any other strike or activity. The current pace just cannot be sustained forever. The second point to make is that there's more involved in the Russian offensive than just supplying the missiles. Sustaining a strategic bombing offensive is difficult. It's a question of the flying hours and service requirements for your aircraft, especially if you're putting them into dispersed basing. The reason the Russian bombers were grouped around so few bases, which is why they were vulnerable to those recent apparent drone attacks, is because there aren't that many bases in the Russian Federation that are configured and have all the facilities to support the large strategic bombers. The pre-flight servicing on a Tupolev 160 requires several days, specialized personnel, specialized equipment that just isn't present at most bases in the Russian Federation. So that becomes a limited resource to be husbanded, especially if those bases eventually come under some sort of threat. There's also demands for intelligence resources, reconnaissance resources. After every strike, intelligence needs to assess how much damage was done to each target. Should a target be hit again, or should a target be left off the list? That requires time and resources, satellite time, satellite overpasses, intelligence officers. There's a demand involved in cycling through this information and verifying it to make sure it's not just Ukrainian deception. And keeping this whole cycle going week after week is going to put strain on the system. And intelligence is particularly important when you're talking about targeting problems. For example, let's just say you want to destroy a transformer station and you know it is not defended by air defense and your missiles are 95% accurate and you're happy with a 90% chance of destroying the target. Well, you allocate one missile to that target. But if it might be defended, well, you need to start increasing the number of missiles you allocate so that you can overwhelm the air defense. If you get this decision wrong in either direction, you're in trouble. If you don't think there's any air defense present, so you underservice a target and the missile gets intercepted, the target survives, which is a failed mission. If the target is not in fact defended, but you think you are, then you fire far more missiles than are necessary at a particular target in order to destroy it, which might make some targets uneconomical to hit when you're talking about weapons that you have a very limited stockpile of. So intelligence assessments and that reconnaissance matters. If you're wasting missiles on defended targets that are intercepted, if you're firing missiles at targets that are actually destroyed and wasting ordnance, then you're undermining the sustainability of the whole offensive. But the Ukrainians face deep sustainment issues as well, both relating to their air defense and also to their energy grid. The flip side of Russian challenges to supply missiles is the Ukrainian requirement for more launches and more missiles to fire out of their launches to defend their targets. There's three closely related challenges here: the speed at which they can bring in Western systems to replace their Soviet systems, their ability to get new missile reloads for their old Soviet systems, because at the moment they're still very reliant on Buk and S-300, and the ability to introduce aircraft into their system before things like S-300 deplete, because there is no Western equivalent in terms of total reach to something like S-300. If they want to continue to contest the airspace in the same way, when the S-300s eventually deplete, and thankfully Ukraine started the war with many thousands of S-300 missiles, it seems, they're going to need an aircraft. They're going to need an air superiority fighter capable of challenging Russian raids. And there are certainly efforts happening on all of these fronts. In terms of sustaining the Soviet systems, we've seen the Ukrainians reach out to governments around the world to try and get reloads for their missiles. We've seen activities in the arms trading and supply sector. And we've also seen more Warsaw Pact era systems sort of begin to mysteriously surface in Ukraine. Some of these were announced, like the S-300 that arrived early on. Others not so announced. For example, recently, this Polish surface-to-air missile launcher, this S-125, an upgraded version of the old S-125, happened to appear in Ukraine suddenly. No idea how it got there. Poland, do you have any idea how your missile system got to Ukraine? It's a mystery. And then there's the NATO systems, where we have seen the introduction of Hawk, of NASAMS, of IRIS-T, of the French systems, of additional SHORAD support, things like Gepard and Avenger. We've seen discussions around Patriot. Patriot is unfortunately capable, yes, but very expensive and difficult to deploy compared to some of these other systems. And the US has certainly been placing long-range orders, or authorizing DoD to make long-range orders for the missiles to fuel these systems. But in the short run, there are shortages of everything. There are shortages of launchers and reloads in Ukraine. There are no shortage of AIM-120s to fire out of NASAMS in Ukraine, but there is a shortage of them in Ukraine, and particularly there's a shortage of the launchers. As for getting Ukraine Western standard fighter jets, it has been discussed basically since the war began, and as yet there's no concrete proof that they're incoming. Overall, my evaluation would be that Ukraine is basically on the clock here. The recent introduction of Western systems has increased their claimed interception rate and decreased the damage of the Russian raids, but they're going to need a lot more, and they're going to need it quickly and sustainably. And the other thing Ukraine is going to need, other than the ability to defend itself, is the ability to repair and regenerate its infrastructure. As we saw from the German examples during World War II, the ability to repair through damage is one of the things that makes strategic bombing so difficult. But the energy sector is a hard one to surface in terms of repairs. Ukraine began the war with a certain number of spare parts, but the sort of transformers and pieces it needs, those tend to be relatively custom pieces, they're not available in huge numbers, and there's a waiting time on getting those produced. Usually, depending on the transformer or whatnot involved, 6, 12, in some cases even 18 months wouldn't be unheard of. Now, in the short run, European powers and other allies are basically giving the Ukrainians every compatible transformer or piece of kit that they can find in their reserves, or they're ripping it out of their own system, replacing it with something more modern and sending it to Ukraine, anything to keep the spare parts flowing. But in the long run, those new build components are going to be required. which means ultimately the race is on to patch the grid, to hold it together, to try and keep Ukraine functional as much as it possibly can be until new supplies can be manufactured or they find a way to adapt the grid to use newer components or less bespoke ones. In terms of affecting the well-being of the Ukrainian people, the efforts of manufacturers, repair workers, and donors are likely to be almost as impactful as the effort of the air defense troopers operating the surface-to-air missiles. On the flip side, it probably also means the Russian strategy is time-bounded. If they can't force Ukraine to surrender before factory production catches up with requirements and a steady supply of spare parts becomes available, well, then the tactic probably just won't work anymore. And all this talk about repair and improvisation goes to one of the key reasons that I think early theoreticians of strategic bombing tended to get it wrong, and why so many thinkers in so many fields tend to get their projections wrong. It's the question of adaptation. One of the easiest ways to get analysis and projection wrong is to assume that people don't change their behavior. If a line is going up, the line goes up forever. If a line is going down, a line goes down forever. At its most benign, it assumes an opponent will react in a consistent and predictable fashion. The air defense is designed in a particular way. If I attack it, it's going to respond the same way each time. At its most damaging, it assumes an opponent is actively stupid. If you've ever seen a fake self-defense guru show off some incredibly complex self-defense move with like 16 steps that only functions because their opponent acts in a very specific, predictable, choreographed, and idiotic way, well, then you've seen this in person. Scenario planning or war games in militaries that assumes the opponent has all the adaptive intelligence of the StarCraft 1 AI aren't really fit for purpose. And history seems to suggest that when people are being bombed from the sky, they tend to be pretty well motivated to, change things, since it seems that most humans are opposed to the idea of being helplessly bombed from above. The targets you're trying to hit, for example, can adapt. They can scale up their defenses. The troops defending them can learn better techniques for repelling those offensives. The facilities themselves can be hardened against bomb damage, and as a result, the target becomes harder and harder. If you consider the Linebacker example I gave earlier of that German synthetic oil plant, the first raid on that plant killed 126 workers. The 21 subsequent raids killed 175. Because after the first raid, they learned a lot of hard lessons about how to minimize casualties during bombing. And the evidence we have available to us suggests that we're seeing some of this in Ukraine. Interception rates are overall trending up over time as ground-based air defense learns better how to deal with these target types. When the first Shahed drones were used against Ukrainian targets, they were an unknown target type. Now there are specialized weapon systems being brought in and troops understand better how to counter them. The same theory applies on the Russian side. Look what they did to their ammunition depots after HIMARS was introduced. They responded to them all being blown up by Gimler's rockets by dispersing them into smaller dumps and moving them further away from the front so it was more difficult to target them with HIMARS. On the downside, it made it more difficult for them to supply their forward artillery positions, but on the upside, there were considerably fewer massive ammunition explosions. And it's not just targets that can adapt to being hit. Systems can as well. Countries can adapt to bombing threats in a variety of ways. They can disperse their industrial structures, sure, but they can also do things like establish the Organization for Rapid Repair, the way the Germans organized hundreds of thousands of people into repair units during the Second World War. So when a target is knocked out, there is a central resource available to quickly bring it back online. Operators of energy utilities can become better at using rolling blackouts, better at stabilizing the grid, better at accounting for and dealing with damage. If you have never had to deal with an attack on critical parts of your power system before, it's going to be a bit of a surprise. If you're dealing with it every 2 weeks, then you've probably got a plan. That doesn't mean the attacks aren't damaging, it doesn't mean they don't hurt, but it means the impact is mitigated compared to what it would have been before you adapted. If Ukrainian hospitals and train stations are equipped with backup diesel generators for when the power goes out, then the damage for any particular power outage is lesser because critical infrastructure continues to function. If there are heating and shelter points for those that are impacted by blackouts, well, again, the losses resulting from that blackout are still very real, but they are lessened. And the final point is that society, people, can adapt to strategic bombing as well in a variety of ways. These adaptations can range from the small and the personal all the way up to the societal level. To illustrate this point, during the recent December rounds of attacks, I contacted, while the missiles were still flying, a number of the Ukrainians I know in some of the targeted cities, and I asked one of them if he'd made it to the bunker. And what he told me instead was that no, he'd gone and bought some extra sandwiches because he was working, he was busy, he didn't need to go to a shelter. That when the air raid warning came down, the response across the office was pretty organised. Someone said, hey, put the kettle on because if we want tea or coffee later and there's a power outage, we need to have hot water. Make sure that we've stored water for later, make sure that we're prepared. That in his house, he now has a little camping stove, so if he has no power in his apartment and no gas, he can still cook. He's got food supplies saved up, he's got water saved up, he's got a whole bunch of insulating material that he's been able to source, so if he loses heating for a protracted period of time, he can stack that up and keep warm. He's provisioned himself essentially for survival. He's got a bunch of battery and power packs to keep his electronics running during longer blackouts. The list goes on. People without running water in cities rig up hillbilly showers, get used to collecting water from water collection points, rig up rain collection systems, get water purifiers and filters, whatever they can in order to just adapt to the situation they find themselves in. At a larger societal scale, you can move populations out of major population centers, out of the big cities and into the countryside, to places where they can burn wood for fuel and where disruptions aren't as great. Life is a lot better when you have power. Life is a lot better when you have access to modern utilities, but people can survive without them, and society can adapt to those things being interrupted. Historically speaking, during wars, people tend to accept that life is going to be tough and focus on trying to get through it any way they can. And there was evidence for this all the way back in the 1940s with the findings of the USSBS, which looked at the impact of bombing on morale in Germany. And what it found was the impact of bombing on morale isn't linear. It's not directly proportionate. The first amount of bombing, a little bit of bombing, has a significant impact on morale, but it takes ever more bombing to get the same result thereafter. The first time you see an apartment building hit by a missile, you're going to be shocked. The 50th time you see an apartment building hit by a missile, it's not going to have the same impact. And so if you want to double the impact on the civilian population's morale, it's not enough to double the intensity of attacks. And if I was the Russians, that's an effect I'd be very concerned about in Ukraine, because morale hasn't broken yet, and I don't have the munitions reserved to continue doing what I'm doing forever, let alone massively escalate the scale on which I'm doing it. If firing 400 cruise missiles hasn't solved the problem, I don't have 4,000 spare in order to up the ante. So with all that said, what do the lessons of history and the stats that we have available to us so far suggest is likely to happen next? At the very least, it seems that both sides are now locked in a vicious resupply race. The Ukrainians are in a precarious position. They desperately need more SAM launchers, they need more missiles, they need aircraft, they need repair parts for their energy infrastructure. They need so much material in order to make up their losses and continue to defend against these attacks. At the same time, the Russians need more missiles if they're going to sustain these attacks in the longer term. They know that eventually Ukraine is going to run out of missiles for things like the S-300, which are critical to the current defensive scheme. But also they're likely to run out of missiles to attack Ukraine with eventually as well. So the race is on there to try and source components despite sanctions and keep production lines running. The Ukrainians, for their part, will continue to attempt to adapt, both at a personal level in terms of stocking up and protecting oneself, although that's obviously easier for young people with jobs in major cities to do than it is for pensioners in towns that are close to the front. The Ukrainian network and system will continue to adapt, bringing out diesel locomotives, or even, I think in some cases, steam locomotives, in order to replace electric ones on areas of depowered track, instituting backup power for rail stations, hospitals, critical infrastructure, prioritization and focus on where you re-energize parts of the network. In terms of transportation, also just consolidating the schedule, running trains at particular times with more carriages, so that you get the cargo moved and you save power during the periods where you are electrifying the lines. Lots of different ways that Ukraine can and likely will continue to adapt. It may be that we also see a movement of more people out of Ukraine's major cities, whether that's into the European Union or whether that's into the countryside where, like I said, they can burn wood and look after themselves in more traditional ways, remains to be seen. But that is an option if you need to bring demand down in the major urban centres. What is probably much less likely, but certainly is possible and worth discussing, is the fact that there could be a decision made to give Ukraine a potential to strike back against the facilities launching these missiles. It's one thing to try and keep giving Ukraine more ground-based air defenses in order to fend off these attacks. Another option is, given there aren't many air bases supporting these aircraft and there aren't many ships that launch caliber from the Black Sea, giving them missiles that can hit those targets. Some pro-Russian channels are certainly worried about this possibility, One channel came up with a rumor, for example, that the Poles were going to integrate the Storm Shadow stealth cruise missile with Ukrainian aircraft and allow them to hit Russian targets basically with impunity. I haven't seen any evidence that is actually happening. Seems like just an internet rumor to me. But the reason I think it's worth asking the question is because it's another potential adaptation that could be made in the event the Russian campaign starts to be too successful. If, for example, the Russians got to the point where they had done so much damage to Ukrainian infrastructure that it genuinely seemed like the Ukrainian war effort might collapse, would the Western powers simply accept that? Or would they risk escalation by introducing a new weapon system that removed the threat of these sort of attacks? Open question. We'll also have to wait and see what Ukraine can come up with in terms of domestic solutions, given it has been able to launch very small scale attacks on these air bases already. But leaving aside all of the hypotheticals, the details, the uncertainties, I want to close by circling back to a question I asked right at the start. Does strategic bombing work? And my core broad assessment would be that while it can have a devastating impact on military production, struggles when it comes to breaking the morale of a civilian population. The people of North Korea continued even though their country was basically flattened. The people of London did not give in when their city was destroyed. The residents of Leningrad endured through a siege that killed hundreds of thousands of residents. The citizens of Japan were willing to resist even after Tokyo was burned and nuclear weapons were dropped on their country. Why would anyone look throughout history and think that making the lives of a civilian population miserable would induce them to overthrow their government and surrender? It is potentially possible that Ukraine becomes an exception, that it breaks this pattern of historical precedent. But if your grand strategy relies on the theory that a Slavic population is going to surrender because times get really tough and unpleasant, I'm going to ask if you've ever read a history book. And I'm probably also going to point out that the best available surveys we have, both from the Russians and the Ukrainians, suggest that support for continuing the war in Ukraine amidst bombardment, loss of power, and utilities is higher than it is in Russia, where none of these things are a problem. And a number of Russian commentators have called this out, perhaps no one better than the famous Strelkov. This is someone who helped found the DPR. This man is a true believer who believes that Russia needs to crush Ukraine, who was calling for mobilization long before the government agreed to it, and who has been doing his absolute best to get to the front lines and actually actively contribute, even if it has to be as a private soldier. In short, he's very much on the Russian side. And yet he recently said that Ukraine will not freeze in the winter. It will not rebel, and it will not vice versa. It's soldiers who've got confidence as a result of their autumn victories and who feel that they are fully supported by NATO will only fight harder and harder against those they consider the Muscovites. They will avenge the hardships that their relatives and friends in the rear are forced to bear. In other words, not even all the Russians are convinced that this will work. I don't want to mitigate the damage that has been and probably will be done. I don't want to turn a blind eye away from the immense suffering involved here. For vulnerable populations, especially not having power during the winter, not having piped water, these things are significant threats. People will lose their lives. Strategic bombing may not be very good historically at getting people to surrender. It's very good at inflicting tremendous suffering on civilian populations. But that's the key. It inflicts suffering, it inflicts pain, but it doesn't necessarily induce people to give up. And certainly that carries through in the interviews and polls that you see come out of Ukraine. People, in many cases, will complain. They'll blame local authorities or the government for not repairing their infrastructure quickly enough. They'll complain their living standards are unacceptable. But ask them if that means Ukraine should surrender Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Donetsk and Lugansk in order to stop the bombing, and they'll look at you like you just shot their dog. I acknowledge that personal stories, interviews are extremely small microcosms that may or may not be representative, which is why I try and talk about polling data and behaviors as well as points in time and individual interviews. But one did stand out to me. There was an interview with an older woman in her 70s who has not had access to water for an incredibly long time now. The infrastructure for water in Mykolaiv was damaged. They ran water, which is basically non-usable, through the pipes as a desperation measure, which is corroded pipes, which means some people don't have access to water. So every day they go and they collect water from the water collection points so they have something to drink. Power is utterly unreliable. The standards of living are primitive. And yet you can see her closing statement on the page there. I'm ready to do this every day for the rest of my life if it means those bastards never reach Mykolaiv. Now, we can suggest that all of these interviews are fake, that this is all just propaganda, and certainly in times of war, governments will push propaganda. But it's a statement that has deep historical precedent behind it. People throughout history hate being bombed, but they hate surrendering to people who bomb them even more. So, in conclusion, strategic bombing can significantly disrupt military operations and industrial production, but only if it's sustained with persistence and undertaken at scale. The vulnerability of targets tends to decrease over time as targets, systems, and individuals adapt to being attacked. The Russian attacks so far have had a noticeable impact on civilian living standards, and they've had some military impact, but those impacts seem very unlikely to prompt the Ukrainians to surrender, even if they markedly increase in severity. For the Russians, a sustainability failure will mean giving the Ukrainians time to repair their power grid and making this whole thing basically worthless. On the Ukrainian and NATO side, a failure to sustain their defense could mean the complete collapse of Ukraine's critical utilities, something that would be incredibly devastating. What happens from here is significantly impacted by the decisions that Western countries make. How quickly are they able to supply equipment to repair Ukraine's power grid? How quickly can they push additional ground-based air defense systems into Ukraine? How much ammunition can they provide? Are they willing to provide Ukraine with access to fighter aircraft to contest their airspace? Are they willing to escalate and clear Ukraine to use munitions to attack Russian bomber bases that launch these standoff missile attacks? All else being equal, more Western support equals less suffering for the Ukrainian population. But one thing I remain unclear on even here is that even if the Russian campaign achieves its maximal objectives, I'm not sure how it's meant to win the war. Strategic bombing doesn't have a great historical record of winning wars on its own, especially not when the country being targeted can pull support from neighbouring countries. As long as the Ukrainian people are willing to resist, and as long as other countries are willing to supply Ukraine with the tools it needs to resist, then attacking Ukrainian infrastructure doesn't provide Russia with a clear path to victory, just a path to inflicting unnecessary suffering on the Ukrainian civilian population. And with every strike, I suspect, a further erosion of the brotherhood that Russia likes to insist exists between Ukrainians and Russians. Okay, channel update to close out. In terms of the channel, I'll breeze over this because I don't think it's particularly important right now. The one thing I want to say is the subscriber growth has been completely insane. I put out the goal of saying, hey, can we hit 300,000 in December? And we're already at 300.2 by the time that I'm recording this, which is truly phenomenal. The more important thing I want to talk about is the charity vote. There's a lot of civilian suffering going on in Ukraine right now. And while communication, understanding with the outside world is important, is an important part of what we do, I'm very keen for what I do here to also have an impact for the very real people who are going through very real and very trying times at the moment. There was a vote on the Patreon channel recently on how I should split donations for the month of December. United 24, which is the official Ukrainian government stream, so humanitarian aid on that, won about 80% of the vote, and Polish humanitarian causes won 20%. So I'm going to be splitting donations for the month that way, funded from the pool provided by sponsorships. There'll be a number of payments made over the course of December. By the time this video goes live, I should have made at least the first one, and I think I've allocated $5,000 in revenue towards that first payment towards United 24. I'll take out fees and taxes, and everything else goes to that particular cause. It's not much in the scale of what is going on there and the amount of damage to infrastructure and people's lives that is taking place, but I hope that it helps. It's the reason I have sponsors on the channel, so thank you once again to Morning Brew for being a continued sponsor. I'm hoping it makes a very real difference. And also thank you to all of you who watch and continue to engage. It means the absolute world to me. And I look forward to seeing you again with hopefully a slightly less heavy topic next week. Take care.